You're listening to This Motorcycle Life, conversations about why we ride. Episode 21, Fear Itself. I'm Bruce Philp, and thank you for listening. So, does riding motorcycles ever scare you? Well, my next guest thinks maybe it should, but not for the reasons you think. He's a veteran motorcycle journalist who by day just happens to be a clinical psychologist who treats anxiety disorders. When you hear what he has to say, well, you might just learn to love those butterflies. We'll meet him in a moment. But first, let's take care of some housekeeping. I thought it was time again for a shout-out to my friends at Eat, Sleep, Ride. Well, this is a non-commercial podcast, but I like to promote these guys partly because the founders are friends of mine, and also partly because I believe in what they're doing. Eat, Sleep, Ride is based on the idea that the key to motorcycle safety is community, and you can be part of it with their free mobile app. I use mine to record rides, share routes, and connect with other riders, and I'm a big fan of the optional crash light feature, which can detect a crash and instantly send your location information to someone who can help. Joining the Eat, Sleep, Ride community is as easy as downloading the app from your preferred app store, and you should check it out. And thanks, as always, for your recent ratings and reviews, and for the generous emails, which really keep me inspired. Especially memorable this month was a note from an iron butt rider in Texas who discovered the podcast thanks to Melissa Holbrook Pearson, who, as you may recall, wrote a book about riders like him. The picture he painted of listening to the Rockstar episode while flying down an empty desert highway at 2 a.m. really made an impression. Well, I'm not sure this is the podcast I'd choose to stay awake, but it's an honor to ride with you. Stay safe out there, and thanks for sharing your story. Okay, here we go. If you listened to my previous episode, you might recall me giving a shout-out to a listener in Belgium who suggested that fear might make an interesting topic for this show. It's a demon he said he struggled with, and I think he might have wondered whether he was alone in this. Well, in fact, he's far from alone. Fear has come up a few times in the stories I've heard from listeners, twice just in the last month. I know I can't generalize this to all motorcyclists, but it seems almost certain to me that at least some of the riders you waved at on your last outing were navigating their own invisible line between ecstasy and terror. You never really know what's going on inside someone else's helmet. And I couldn't stop thinking about this. I've spent a lifetime trying things that scared the hell out of me, and honestly, I've come to think of fear as something that diminishes you, a sign that you're not where you're supposed to be, doing what you're supposed to do. Motorcycling, for me, has been different. Like any sane person, I was scared when I took up riding again, but that quickly went away, replaced by something else that was just as challenging, but far less discouraging. Somehow, this fear was worth it. Instead of being beaten by it, I felt like I was growing, and it made me love doing this all the more. In this, I don't think I'm alone either, and I wanted to know why. Well, the completeness of the motorcycling universe appears to have no limits. As proof, I offer Dr. Mark Barnes. You may know Mark as a writer for Motorcycle Consumer News, an excellent monthly magazine for riders that remarkably has been 100% subscriber-supported for half a century. Mark has been writing for them for nearly 20 of those years, and is obviously an avid rider. But while he's described his time with MCN as a dream job, it's not actually his profession. Mark Barnes is a practicing clinical psychologist who has seen our fear from both sides. Well, I couldn't have imagined a more qualified or more empathetic expert to shed some light on this riding companion that no one likes to talk about, or a more generous one. I reached Dr. Mark Barnes at his home in Knoxville, Tennessee. At the foot of the Smoky Mountains, he hastened to add. Apparently, the riding there is amazing. Hey, Mark, how are you?
I'm doing well, Bruce. I'm glad to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. I really appreciate you making the time for me. I imagine you're a busy guy, what with 2 careers, so I especially appreciate it.
Well, I'm always happy to make time for talking to people about motorcycles. I can't imagine anything I'd rather do.
I get that a lot, and I share that view, much to my wife's chagrin. So why don't we dive into it, right? There was actually a funny exchange in the last episode about this where I think I was being interviewed in another podcast, and I said, that my wife had suggested I start this one so that maybe I would stop talking to her about motorcycles, and the person I was speaking to said, yes, so now you talk to her about podcasting too. There is some truth in that. So why don't we dive in? So out of fairness to you, I want to sort of start by acknowledging that, I'm really excited to speak to you specifically because you have those two careers that I mentioned earlier, being a psychologist and being a motorcycle journalist. And so everything we're going to talk about, every question I'm going to ask you is sort of pointed at the intersection of those two things. But I want you to know that I know you're not a motorcycle fear scientist, if there's any such thing. And so I'm going to repeatedly be asking you to tell me about your observations and speculations. And I just thought, for your sake and for the benefit of our listeners, I would just acknowledge that this is not always going to be a clinical perspective, if that sounds fair.
Yes.
Okay, well, so let's dive in. This might be kind of a giant question for an opener, but I wonder if you'd feel comfortable sort of setting the stage for us by explaining a little bit about what the utility of fear is for humans in general. So in kind of evolutionary and psychological terms, what is fear? What is its purpose in our lives?
Well, that is a big question, and my answer may not do it justice, but I see fear or anxiety. Actually, let me start by making a distinction between those two things.
Okay.
Because they're not identical. Fear, as I use the term, is when you're afraid of something in particular. Anxiety is sort of a state of alarm or readiness for something dangerous to happen that may not have a specific villain associated with it. So people can be anxious and not be able to identify a specific thing that they feel threatened by. Fear is more precise and usually involves some fantasy of, now by fantasy, I don't mean necessarily unrealistic, but some idea of a particular threat or danger or negative outcome. So I would say that fear is fundamentally about survival, both of the individual and ultimately the species. And for all of us to survive, we ought to be afraid of things that will hurt us so that we can perhaps avoid them, but short of avoiding them, that we will take some protective measures to ensure that, the worst doesn't happen.
Right.
And that facilitates our survival and the survival of the species. And that's the thumbnail sketch of my sense of its utility.
Right. That's a very interesting distinction, fear versus anxiety. And I have a feeling we'll probably come back to it. Is the anxiety piece of this, is it vestigial in some way? In other words, in modern life, are we capable of more fear or anxiety than there are actually things to be afraid of?
Oh, most certainly. I would say that neurotic anxiety is exactly that people can become quite worked up or incapacitated by worries that really are quite unlikely to, really come to fruition. And We take all sorts of protective measures that may be completely unnecessary and really limit our liveliness on the basis of such.
Right. Yeah. So this starts to feel like it might become the theme of this conversation, because my next question was going to be, what roles does this play specifically in the life of a motorcyclist? The word fear, which is the word I came into this thinking that I would use, sort of conjures up this monolithic disability. But it seems to me that it probably does things both for and to us as riders. Would you say that's true? And can you talk a bit about that relationship?
Well, yeah. I think most simply, fear is an asset when it prompts us to be safe and to take measures to protect ourselves. And it's problematic when it is a preoccupation that distracts us from actually being safe, or reduces the enjoyment that we can have while riding. I mean, if I'm constantly preoccupied with the possibility that I will crash, I'm not going to have a fun ride. But knowing that crashing is always a possibility might prompt me to ride within my limits and wear proper safety gear and, a number of other things that would contribute to my safety. If I'm scared, ironically or paradoxically, I really might be less safe if
Right.
I'm so alarmed that I can't attend to what are the real dangers in front of me. If I'm worried about some kind of catastrophic fall, I may be oblivious to some relatively minor danger in my, in the road ahead of me or the trail ahead of me. And therefore, I actually get into an accident because I was so afraid of getting into an accident.
Right.
And so there's kind of an optimal level of anxiety. In fact, in psychology, there's a fancy word for it. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson law, and Yerkes is Yerkes. And it says that there is an optimal level of anxiety. Underneath that level, people are too complacent or distracted or, oblivious to do the things that would be in their best interest, or just too unmotivated. And then above the optimal level, people are so alarmed that their attention is fragmented, they make impulsive decisions, etc. And, that works against them as well. But we ought to have some measure of tension about real dangers.
Right.
And, finding that sweet spot is, I think, the key.
Yeah. Yeah, there is sort of a bubble there, which I am going to ask you again about that in connection with an article you wrote, because it feels to me like kind of the key to all this for riders. So speaking of riders, in your observation, would you say, how would you score us as a tribe in terms of which side of that line we're on? Do we tend to be, as a breed, too anxious or not anxious enough, or what do you make of us?
Wow, that I don't know how to begin to answer that. I think there are riders scattered all over that spectrum.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't have any way of forming an opinion about that. It seems like that is there are as many different locations on the spectrum for riders as there are for any other population, and so. I don't know. I mean, I think that the people that stand out, to me at least, are probably the people beneath the optimal level of anxiety. I don't think twice about seeing somebody in full, who's an ATGAT person, all the gear all the time. I pass them on the road and they don't stand out to me. But somebody who's riding in flip flops and a tank top and shorts, I immediately think that person is going to have a lot of flesh removed when the asphalt, reaches their bone. Mm. So I perhaps that's idiosyncratic to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are more of those people. They just stand out more to me.
Right. Yeah, that sounds right. There was now I wish I had looked this up before we spoke, but there was a transportation, theorist who created a taxonomy of risk, and one of the risk types was what he called valorizers. So people who valorize risk are the ones that theatrically flaunt their disregard for it. And the conclusion that you might reach reading about this in connection with motorcyclists is that those, in fact, are the loudest voices in the sport, but they don't actually represent who we are overall. And I think that's probably what you're saying. I wonder about the people who are on the other side of that line. It's always seemed to me that, we might as a breed have more anxiety than we're prepared to show, and that covering it up is kind of part of our identity as riders. I just can't accept that everyone I see on a bike is as calm and laissez-faire as they look. Do you think that's true?
Well, I hope so, because if not, then I guess I should be more chagrined than I am about my own fearfulness. I think that people go to a lot of lengths to manage their fear, and some of that has to do with getting good training or wearing protective gear. Some of it has to do with the way that we portray ourselves or talk to others, and not valorize risk, but in some sense reassure ourselves that the problems are going to happen to somebody else and not us. And we all maneuver in numerous, maybe countless ways to kind of maintain our own psychological equilibrium, and dealing with the anxiety of the dangers of motorcycling is certainly one of those things. And I have my ways of trying to manage it, and perhaps to some others that hear me talk or ride with me, they may imagine that I'm relatively less fearful than they are. But first of all, I don't know actually how to quantify that, but I'm sure that's not true. I imagine myself to be at least as fearful as everybody else that I have ever ridden with.
Right.
And probably more so. And, I wouldn't necessarily broadcast that. I might sort of put a softer edge on it by appearing modest about my skills. Something like that to kind of lower expectations and let them know that I'm not really going to be pushing the envelope in the way that they might be. I might not say, because I'm so scared, although that would be a factor. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does, actually. And I thought I was the only motorcyclist who sandbags when I was talking to other riders. So I'm greatly comforted by that. I think when we spoke last week, you hinted that your exposure to motorcycle journalists had a bit of a theme like this, where they initially seemed very confident and full of bravado, and that you'd come to see them differently over time. Did I get that right? And can you talk about that a bit?
No, you did not get it right. You gave me a more generous interpretation than I deserved. What I meant was not that I had learned that other motor journalists were, as less fearful than they presented, but that when I started in motor journalism, I wanted to be like the people that I was reading, and so I presented myself as less fearful than I really was.
Right, okay.
And over the years, I guess I've become more. I'm less self-conscious about my own fearfulness, and I've grown to believe that probably a lot of people that write with a bolder style may actually not be as bold as they seem in their writing. I mean, I am not as bold as I seemed in my early writing. So perhaps that's true of other people as well. But it's not like I've had confessionals with other motor journalists who confided in me and said, I'm really not that brave. And well, actually, let me say something about that. While I've used that term, I misused it right then. Brave is not fearlessness. Brave is doing something when you're afraid. If you have no fear, well, bravery is not required.
Right.
So being courageous or brave, these are things that imply the kind of precondition of being afraid.
Yeah. I think that's something a lot of writers need to hear. I mean, I think when we spoke last week, I told you that this episode had been inspired by, letters I'd received from people, emails, who were kind of tentatively sort of testing, are they the only ones who get afraid on a motorcycle? And is that maybe something we should talk about? And I think that definition is pretty solid, and I think it's important to people who do this. Now, I feel as though over the years I've met riders who didn't seem to experience fear. An example in this podcast, Freddie Spencer would be an obvious example. This is not someone who, as near as you could tell by talking to him, has ever been afraid on a motorcycle, or certainly never talked about it. I interviewed a guy named Todd Egan who wrote for Cycle World a little bit, but is primarily other things, including a riding coach. And I was talking to him about cornering specifically, and I've ridden with him or attempted to, and he seemed to me like as cool as an astronaut. And so I guess my question is, are there people like that, or are they just doing a better job of covering it up, in your opinion? And have you ever known riders like this?
Yeah, I think I have. Although it's really hard to say. Is it one or the other? I'm absolutely certain that both types exist. I think there are people with extraordinary, how should I put it? They have extraordinary talent, and perhaps they get started in the skill development early, so that they have a kind of confidence that's quite realistic, because they have extraordinary physical mastery. And people in the upper echelons of racing or any sport for that matter. These are very often people with freakish capabilities. They are not like you and me. They're born with something different, and then that gets cultivated by the experiences that they have once they've emerged from the womb. But they're not, we're not really all equal when it comes to our endowment.
That is for sure.
and certainly not. We're certainly not all equal in terms of the kind of learning experiences that we have, and when we get to have them. So I'm sure there are people who are fearless, but they're they're fearless in a way that is, pretty realistic because they have a level of mastery. Now, there's another type of person who is fearless based on less realistic considerations, and so they're fearless because fearlessness is a way to achieve or maintain status in a particular group. So they present as fearless. They may not be fearless at all, but it's a kind of a facade, or they really may be fearless because they do not understand or take seriously the risks present. And so they may not be very afraid just because the risks don't really carry much weight for them. That's
yeah.
I guess that's a different version of fearlessness.
Yep. Yeah, it almost needs its own label. This is the same culture that, measures people's chicken strips, so-called. I'm curious about, so you talked about these people who are kind of prodigies. And if I follow your logic, the reason why they seem fearless is because they're aware of their own talent and their own skills. I wonder, do you think that's part of the answer for riders, for ordinary riders who are afraid? Do you think that that we underestimate what we can do and perhaps what our bikes can do, and that somehow feeds this anxiety? Is that something we could learn from those guys, do you think? Guys in the gender neutral sense, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that we absolutely underestimate what our bikes can do. In terms of, let's see. I mean, let's just take something you mentioned, cornering. I mean, even a pretty mediocre motorcycle will lean a lot further than most people would believe. And so, yes, we might underestimate what the bike's capable of. Do we underestimate what we're capable of? We might underestimate what we're able to learn, but I think that the confidence comes from repeated experience of success. Okay, so if I'm unsure of my ability to corner, but I go out and I do a lot of cornering, I go to a track day or something like that, and I really get lots of repetition that confirms my level of ability, well, then I'm going to feel confident. I mean, I can't just decide to be confident. Some people have that myth in their heads, that they ought to just be confident, like it's something a person can choose. No, confidence comes from evidence. And so I think our level of evidence tends to be pretty closely aligned, or what did I just say? Evidence? Our level of confidence tends to be pretty closely aligned with the evidence that we've accrued. And so if we have a lot of evidence that we can, lean at a certain angle in corners and pull it off without mishap, then, well, we'll be confident about that.
Right. Right. But I think that, in my mind, this is sort of close to the heart of what makes this such an addictive sport, because acquiring that evidence, you can't acquire that evidence without taking risks, at least micro risks. Every time you get that bike leaned over a little further, you develop confidence from knowing that it can do that and that you can do that. But at the moment you did it, you didn't have that evidence, and you weren't sure how it was going to turn out. And I think that, on a bike,
yes,
that sort of carries special risks, right? Because if you are physically tense, a motorcycle will literally not operate the way that it's supposed to, especially obvious in turns, obviously. But there's no doubt that being scared is dangerous for a motorcyclist, the same as it is for a pilot or a scuba diver. And I guess I'm wondering, so are there ways to suppress that fear in the moment? So if I'm going to take a corner a few kilometers an hour faster than I ever have before, that's uncharted territory for me. Are there ways that I can suppress the fear in real time? so that I can collect that evidence. Does that make sense? It kind of tortured language, but hopefully clear. What's your advice about that?
Well, I would, a couple things. One is that some limits, really can't be learned until they've been crossed. And so there is always the possibility that as you're trying to sneak up on some increased mastery, or you're trying to approach the limit that your machinery allows, that you'll cross over it. That is a real possibility. And, I think that the smaller the increment that you can advance, the better able you're going to be to manage the emotional reaction, as well as, not cross the line. But you don't know where the line is until you've crossed it, unfortunately.
Right.
And so that's always a possibility. So instead of going a few kilometers per hour faster, you might go 1 kilometer per hour faster and try to do it that way. But there's also the issue of directing your attention. And I think this is really the key for moment to moment anxiety management or fear management. We can talk about some, larger scale things, but in the actual moment, the key is to focus your attention on what matters rather than fantasies about what will happen, what's going to go wrong. Okay. So if I am approaching a corner and I find that my mind is being invaded by imagery of me, sliding off the shoulder and descending down the mountain and hitting a bunch of trees on my way down, and picturing myself in traction, etc. Well, I'm not paying attention to how's my speed. How smoothly am I applying the brakes?
Right.
Am I going to clip the apex where it ought to be clipped? And are there other vehicles that I need to be aware of, or places that a vehicle might appear? And where is this corner likely to empty out? What can I tell by surveying the landscape? There are a lot of other things that I could fill my mind with. And your attention only has so much space, and you can't not think about something. You can only displace one thought with another. So if I have, room for X number of things in my mind, well, I better populate that list with things that have to do with the tasks of writing, as opposed to thoughts of my own demise. And so I would say that in the moment, the best thing a person can do to manage anxiety is to redirect their attention to their throttle hand, to their body position, to the scanning the road surface ahead or the trail. And there's no way to just turn off anxiety, but there is a way to refocus your attention. That is something that people can do deliberately. And people can get better at that too. It's not, it may be something that a person has trouble doing, but there are ways to get better at it, at just the refocusing issue. Independent of whether one's riding a motorcycle or doing anything else, there are generic techniques for developing better ability to steer your focus where you want it to go.
Yeah, that's really well put, because it's always struck me as kind of remarkable that we can, so in a highly intense moment, like going around a corner that we've possibly overcooked, the amygdala is completely in charge, and we can somehow superimpose the cerebral cortex right then when we're the most afraid, to kind of like focus on our, throttle position and all the other things that you listed. To me, that seems almost like a core motorcycling skill, and the reason why the people who do this are sometimes so awesome. Can you talk a bit about the ways that people can can learn those tactics?
Well, I would say probably the most direct means is by practicing some version of mindfulness meditation. And people have all sorts of, I think, misguided notions about what meditation is. And there are certainly many versions. But the kind that I'm talking about is really pretty straightforward. You simply set about the task of maintaining a focus on your breathing. And so maybe you decide to sit for 10 minutes, and you're only going to pay attention to your breathing for that 10 minutes. Now, of course, within the first 4 seconds, your mind has already wandered. You're already thinking about something else. So as soon as you catch yourself thinking about something else, you redirect your thoughts without, criticizing yourself or making a big deal out of it. You just turn your attention back to your breath, and you focus on some particular aspect of your breathing. It might be the feeling of your belly rising and falling. It might be the sound of the air through your throat. It might be the feeling of cool air entering your nostrils and warm air exiting your nostrils. It doesn't matter. It just means that you have a point to focus on. And as soon as you notice that you're not thinking about that anymore, you just return your attention to it. And this is extremely difficult. It's the kind of thing where in 10 minutes, maybe you redirect your attention back to your breathing hundreds of times. But with practice, you get better at it. And what you're exercising is the mental musculature for steering your attention. And it's really quite direct in its exercise. So, that's one thing. I would say another thing is that when you notice that you are alarmed, one of the most effective ways that you can intervene in terms of what you can actually decide about how anxious you are is that you breathe. When we're tense, we stop breathing, or we breathe in some very shallow and constricted way. And if we are simply aware of that, and we, you're coming into the corner and you realize, I've overcooked it. Maybe the first thing you do is make sure you're breathing. Now, obviously you're going to be attending to other things at the same time, but it might only take a tiny fraction of a second to make sure that you're breathing. And that makes a difference. Our nervous system is very, very intimately connected to our breathing, both as cause and effect. And so while it's true that when we're tense, we breathe shallowly, it's also true that if we breathe more deeply, it reverses the tension in our nervous system. So, that's a very simple and straightforward thing that people can do. And the more you do it, the more effective it is. I wouldn't expect anybody to just, on their first time trying to breathe their way through a spike in anxiety, I wouldn't expect them to experience much relief. But if it's something that you do on a regular basis, it really does have a lot of power.
Yep, that makes infinite sense. So I'm wondering, so you wrote a story for Motorcycle Consumer News called "The End of the Road" about a guy named who you call Bill. And when you talked about him taking up motorcycling, you described that decision as making the transition from the world of the mind to the world of the body. Is that what you're talking about here? And is that what he ultimately didn't succeed at?
Well, I am here now talking about a bodily intervention as opposed to a, like some kind of rational intervention where you reason your way out of something. I am talking about a purely physiological phenomenon rather than a mental phenomenon. That's not what I had in mind when I was writing that article about Bill. Bill was a highly ideational guy who just really hadn't done a whole lot in the physical world. He was a brilliant guy, and but had never been a part of anything athletic or really bodily. He was kind of a brain that that walked around, and motorcycling actually got him into his body in a way that it had never happened before. And it turns out he really enjoyed inhabiting his body and making use of it. But it was just something that had never really been center stage in his life before.
That's interesting because of course, the way that story ends is that he abandons motorcycling. Was he just unable to overcome his nature, or is there such a thing as too much anxiety?
Well, his anxiety did pry him out of the saddle, but for good reason. He was riding less and less safely because he was riding less and less often. And as he, I think he legitimately assessed his abilities as no longer adequate to maintain some kind of minimal level of safety. And I think that can happen for people, for aging motorcyclists or people whose capacities are diminished for other reasons. It really ought to be something that even young motorcyclists who don't ride very often take into account. I mean, when you don't ride very often, you are always rusty, and you are, you may be enthused about riding and excited to get the opportunity, especially if it doesn't come very often. But your excitement is not the same as your ability. And so oftentimes people that ride seldom, they're all excited about getting out, and they can remember a time when they were able to do such and such, but they haven't done that in a long, long time, and their body would need some, reminding of how things work. They can't just instantly resume where they left off. I mean, that happens each year when people return to riding after a season off, for people who store their bike for the winter, for example.
Yeah, I'm sadly one of those by necessity. And yeah, the spring is always sketchy. You think but you're not sure your body remembers. So I know you ride off road a lot, I think. I haven't ridden a dirt bike since I was a kid, but I was an avid mountain biker for a long time, and that's how I learned not to look at what I don't want to hit. And we wave this off as target fixation, and when we say that we should avoid target fixation. But somebody I interviewed a couple of episodes ago had an interesting point of view on this, and she sort of said, look, if I think enough about bad things, they will manifest themselves. So I wondered, sort of under the heading of talking about fear and anxiety, I wondered if there's something more to target fixation than just directing our attention. I wonder if dwelling on bad things somehow will cause them to come true. Is that too weird, or do you think there's some truth in that?
Well, no, there's certainly a phenomenon. I mean, I think it's quite real, of self-fulfilling prophecy, and people who forecast bad things in their life very often end up engineering them, perhaps unwittingly. And target fixation, I think, it's a real deal all by itself. It is true that where you look is where you go. That's just about, I don't know what to call them, psychovehicular physics or something. But it's also true that, all of us we're all creating the world that we live in as we're living in it. I mean, it's not entirely under our control, but our perceptions are a huge part, probably the biggest part of our reality. And again, I don't want to make it sound like I just think people can have a positive attitude and all their, the real things impinging on them in life just go away. I don't mean that, but I do mean that our outlook determines how many options we're able to see and how likely we are to take them. And so if I really have narrowed my attention down to something horrible, I'm very likely not paying attention to other things, just like in the concrete example of target fixation. If I'm looking at the car I don't want to hit, I'm not looking at my escape route around the car, which could be just as real.
Right. Yeah, like so much of this stuff, it feels like good life advice as well as good riding advice. That makes perfect sense. I'm curious to know, just while we're on that, what is the most afraid you have ever been on a motorcycle?
I thought you would probably ask me that, and in preparation, I have propped up a picture of the very scene right in front of me right now.
Oh, wow.
I am looking at a photograph of my trusty Beta 390 perched on a ledge in Colorado on Mount Antero, and that bike has an altimeter built into the little computer in its dash, and I was at 13,000 some feet.
Oh, God.
And I was in a group of a half a dozen, and you can go all the way up to 14,000 and change on that mountain. And I got to 13 something, and I had been so terrified by the ride up to that point that I locked up and really could not go any further. The rest of my group traveled on to the peak, and they got to say that they, summited Mount Antero, and I couldn't join them because I was so scared. This was just a year ago.
Wow.
And but I was so scared that I really could not go on. And, sometimes fear has to do with the environment. You're afraid of the terrain or what's going to happen to you physically. And that was certainly the case. I mean, the trail up that mountain was so rocky and so steep that it was always a precarious balancing act. You had to maintain enough momentum to get over the boulder in front of you. But if you overdid it, you would go off the side of the mountain, and obviously that's not recommended. So I had absolutely exhausted my capacity for that kind of terror, and I just couldn't function. It ceased to be about my fear of falling off the mountain. It was like I couldn't trust my own body and mind anymore.
Wow.
And so I stopped. And, I look back on it now, and I think actually the stretch, that last 1,000 feet that they went up, was much less challenging than what we had already covered. And, I really wish that I'd gone with them so that I could have, made the same claim about summiting the mountain. But I know that I was not safe. Even though the terrain might have not been such a great big deal anymore, I just couldn't. I'd lost my faith in my own abilities at that point.
Yeah, I'm sure altitude played a role. I hate being so predictable, but that's a pretty good story. Were you changed in any lasting way by that? Did it change the way you ride, or did it redouble your interest in conquering that, or how did that go?
No, I think what it did was it left me feeling like I don't really have to prove anything anymore. I'm probably I'm satisfied with 13,000 feet, and it is I think coming back from that trip, I was riding in the Colorado mountains for several days, and it seemed like every single hour it got more and more treacherous. The whole time I was there, I knew it was going to be challenging, but I did not realize it was going to be a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 every minute. And I think I came back, and I think it's pretty hard to scare me now. I'm sure that if I went back up Mount Antero, I would perhaps find myself in the same place. But a lot of things that I think would have scared me in the past, I just, if you've been beat with a telephone pole, you don't even notice when somebody hits you with a baseball bat.
Right. That vivid image. Yeah, that seems like a healthy reaction. I might be inclined to go, well, I'm never doing that again. That's nature's way of telling me that I'm where I'm not supposed to be, but that's just me. So you wrote another piece for MCN called Fearless, and in that story you talked about the effortless performance of a couple of young riders, and in the writing they seem to be naturally talented, at least partly because they just didn't know any better. You put some of it down to youth and reflexes and strength and all the things that go with being that age, but it made me think a little bit about the four stages of learning thing, the consciously incompetent, all that stuff. It made me think about that in connection with motorcycling, and it seems to me sometimes that people like that succeed partly because they just don't know what could go wrong, and so they're relieved of all the tension and distraction of that knowledge. Do you think fear and awareness have something to do? I guess the answer is obviously going to be yes, but I talk if you could a bit about the connection between fear and being aware and alert.
Well, yes, there is a kind of fearlessness that is based on ignorance or naivete, and also just not having accumulated a lot of experiences of, how long it can take to recover from an injury, or, I certainly recovered from injuries far faster when I was younger, and, I'm just not as interested in convalescence now that I have more experience with it.
Right.
But I'm reminded of the other friend that you mentioned from another story, Bill, who was not very physical. When I was teaching him how to ride, I was really struck by how readily he did exactly what I told him to do. I've taught a lot of people to ride over the years, and Bill was the best student because having not had any experiences that would have, I guess, taught him to be fearful of certain things, he just, he just didn't have any hesitation. And other people that I've taught to ride, they're worried about this or that because the sensation reminds them of whatever, falling on a bicycle or, something from their past. And those were all things that Bill lacked. So he was remarkably free to just follow instructions without any hesitation. I think that people, as they're learning, they can really be crippled by inaccurate fears or unrealistic fears. I mean, there's the old, it's cliche, and I don't know if anybody really still believes this anymore, but there was a period of time when it was in vogue to talk about the the silly misconception that if you, if you use the front brake, you're going to go flying over the handlebars. And
Right.
therefore people, presumably there's this whole group of riders that grew up believing that you should only use the rear brake, which is obviously far inferior for actual stopping. And so people can have misconceptions, and certainly, as we were talking about earlier about cornering, you start to lean and something tells you, wait a minute, you're going to fall over if you lean any further, when in fact, the gyroscopic forces involved actually make it so you have to push the bike down. It really doesn't want to just flop over, above a certain nominal speed. And so people sometimes just need to be educated, although the education has to be paired with experience. I don't think people can learn to not be afraid just on the basis of conceptual understanding. I think they have to actually also have an experiential reference point to go with it. I think I probably wandered far afield from your original question.
No, not at all. No, I think it's. It sounds to me like it harks back a little to something we talked about earlier, and you wrote about it in a column called "Just Fast Enough." This sort of bubble between, pushing yourself too hard and not pushing yourself hard enough. It feels like there's a parallel in terms of knowledge, that there are certain things that if you know them will make you less fearful and more focused, and other things that are just going to be distracting and either irrelevant or terrifying. But my wife started learning to ride last year, and one of the things I got right was when I said to her, "Your motorcycle doesn't actually want to fall down. There's 3 gyroscopes in there." That seemed like helpful on the right side of the bubble. So I'm struck by that parallel, because I had planned to ask you next about that story, Just Fast Enough, but we touched on it earlier. I'm wondering if there's anything you want to add to that. Is this ability to identify the spot where you're pushing yourself hard enough but not too hard, or frankly where you're studying hard enough but not too hard? Is that a learnable skill? Can we somehow know that we've got this right?
Well, in that piece, I quoted somebody that I'd overheard saying something I think is remarkably wise. I was on a trail and I'd stopped somewhere, and I overheard a conversation where an older rider was talking to a younger rider, and he was telling the younger rider that, you're going the right speed. Well, I'm paraphrasing now, but it was something along the lines of, if you can think of anything other than riding, you're going too slow. But if you're thinking about crashing, you're going too fast.
And
that the idea was to modulate your speed in order to be able to think of nothing other than riding, but stop short of stimulating images of crashing.
Right.
And I think that's how people know when they're in the sweet spot. And it's funny, you can, we're talking about using, directing your attention and breathing to manage fear. Well, you can also use the throttle. And if your tension level is too low, you can wick it up. And if your tension level is too high, you can slow it down. I know that sounds so obvious and simplistic as to be inane, but it's absolutely true. And we can sort of manage our mental state with our right wrist.
Right. Yep, that's true. It's true. Except maybe on a long straight highway, in which case, there may be limits to the wisdom of that strategy. Right.
And actually, yes. And so then the issue is one of finding details to sharpen our skills and our attention. If I really, I'm driving through town, maybe it's empty and the roads are empty, and theoretically I could go 80 or 90 miles an hour down a city street. Well, I'm not going to do that. So if I keep close to the posted limit, there's still an awful lot that I can be fine-tuning. I can make sure that my body position is precisely correct. I can try to make sure that every movement I make, every control input is ultra smooth. And there's a whole lot for me to focus on, even if I can't sharpen my attention by increasing my speed.
Yeah, that's interesting. That actually is advice that I might take myself, because I'm sort of at that point where I've ridden enough and with enough success that I'm feeling probably more confident that I have any right to, and I spend a lot of time on the same roads. And you really do find yourself with attention to spare when you're in familiar territory. So that seems like, I suppose probably we should never stop taking that advice. That's great. So maybe this is kind of the natural next thing to talk about. So in another column you wrote called Near Life Experiences, you talked about being in a position where you have no choice and how that makes for experiences that we remember more fondly because they forced us to somehow be our best selves, if I can paraphrase. And this isn't the first time this idea of no choice has come up in this podcast. You wrote once that the degree of difficulty determines the thrill of victory. And that was a big theme in an episode back in May, I think, that I did with a woman who had ridden to Africa with her autistic daughter in a sidecar, kind of unsupported, if you can imagine, in a Ural, and this was what she had come back with, was this idea that her daughter would be her daughter would learn courage if they repeatedly put themselves in situations where they had no choice but to keep going, if that makes sense. And I sort of find that a terrifying idea. I wonder how. I guess I wonder how necessary it is, and I feel I'm curious because even in this conversation, we've been on both sides of this line. That on the one hand we should push ourselves, but on the other hand we should make sure that we don't do so to such an extent that we defeat the purpose and put ourselves in danger. I feel pretty certain that there are some riders listening to this who are wondering if they need to put themselves more in harm's way to truly experience this. And I wonder what you would say to them, because that statement, the degree of difficulty determines the thrill of victory, is a thundering challenge in some ways. What would you say to those riders who are listening right now?
Well, I think perhaps the most important thing to say is that in those situations that you're referencing that I've written about, I didn't go into them willingly. I didn't choose to make them that scary or that difficult or challenging. I mean, I just stumbled into those situations. I kind of think riding involves all sorts of unexpected challenges without us having to kind of fling ourselves into terrible danger. I mean, it's kind of like I don't really have to warn people or alert people that I'm in relationships with that, there are going to be times when they'll find me disappointing. If that's going to happen, and then we'll have to deal with it. And I think there's plenty of challenge in riding without, I guess, just trying to make it extra difficult. Well, I guess there are certainly people, I suppose, who might have a certain kind of limited riding possibility where they're kind of stuck with some ceiling of risk. They can't.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's tricky. Right?
I'm having a hard time imagining why you'd need to go chase something outrageously dangerous. I think there's plenty of danger in it already.
Right. Yep. That makes sense.
And you're going to stumble into situations that force you to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, in which case you need to learn the trick of giving yourself a pat on the back when that happens, I guess, because that all accrues back to this confidence thing we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to suggest that people shouldn't push themselves and go do things that put them outside their comfort zone. I mean, you can go to a track day. You can go try some new trails, but go with somebody who's been before. You don't have to, risk being lost in the wilderness in order to,
right.
To have some sense of accomplishment when you've traversed some challenging terrain.
Yeah.
And you don't have to, risk flying off the side of a mountain. You can go to a track day where they have an ambulance on site and where there are people who are going to teach you how to do a better job of what you're doing. So anyway,
yeah.
maybe I'm not an adventurous enough person to ask that question to.
No, you know what? I don't think there's an answer. To be honest, it just seemed, kind of worth calling that out, that you can't do one and you can't do the other. So your life's work as a rider is going to be trying to find that spot in the middle, which, I think we predicted at the beginning of this conversation would end up somehow being the theme. When we spoke last week, I teased you that anybody who rides KTMs must not have any anxiety problems, so we can leave that aside. But I was thinking afterwards that the motorcycle itself really can be an actor in all this. I mean, I'm repeatedly struck by how distinct the personalities of motorcycles can be, and I'm wondering, if what we ride can make fear worse or make it better, and and here again, when we pick a bike, how do we draw the line between pushing ourselves to improve and making the thing that we fear actually happen? I mean, I assume you agree that the bike can be an actor in all this. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the bike plays a supporting role. I mean, the person who bought the bike is really the actor. For a long time, I was I fancied myself a sporting motorcyclist who had to have the latest, greatest sport bike. And I spent way too much money, chasing spec sheet prestige. And I'd get faster and faster motorcycles, and I would go slower and slower on them. Partly because as I've aged, my risk tolerance has declined, but there's also something about having a motorcycle that scares you that really prevents you from learning how to ride it better. Mm. And so if you are enamored by ultra powerful machinery, but you don't have top 1% skill, as most of us don't.
Right.
It's quite possible that you'll go slower on a really fast machine than you would on something that's a better match for your actual skill level. You mentioned the KTM. I mean, I have an old 990 Super Duke that is my only KTM now. I've had many different ones, dirt and street, over the years, but I have held on to this 2007 motorcycle. I'll happily admit that I cannot ride it at the level that it's capable of performing, but there is something about the way that bike fits me that just feels really good, and I feel confident on it, and I feel very comfortable, and it is like, the proverbial old shoe for me. And so I would say that certainly the match between a rider and the bike is a big part of it, and it should be a bike that doesn't intimidate you, and it should be a bike that really feels right, like it does the things that you expect it to do intuitively. And there's such a wide range of bikes out there, and many of them, won't do that for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's my impression. I think probably experience, years kind of smooth this out a little bit. But I will confess that I have ridden motorcycles that made me feel incompetent, and not just because they were fast, for other reasons too. And I've ridden other motorcycles, and I would say that at least one of the bikes I have now qualifies, that just were like like an experienced old horse. Like they were up for anything you were up for, but they were always going to be there for you if you made a mistake. And so the most capable bike I have in my barn is in every way also the sleepiest bike, if that makes sense. And so it relaxes me, and I therefore end up pushing it harder, and I kind of end up learning more, if that makes sense. Given that to some extent this episode serves some people who had a question about fear, it seemed worth talking about the bike choice in that context. I'm curious to know whether you think that bike choice is part of a strategy of dealing with fear. I guess is the character of a bike as important as its power and handling.
Yes, and I would say that people do far better to buy a bike that is at or beneath their level of ability than to buy a bike thinking that they're going to be buying skill. I mean, I have had some bikes where I got on it and I just instantly felt worlds more competent because the bike was so well engineered. But by and large, really, I learn more when I'm thrashing around on something that I am not afraid of, and I'm pushing it to its limits and learning how motorcycles behave at their limits. I mean, you're learning about a motorcycle, but you're also learning something about motorcycles in general. The more different motorcycles you can ride, the more you learn about that larger domain.
Yeah.
You start to be able to extrapolate and interpolate, and any motorcycle that you're on gets factored into this larger data pool, and it's less and less remarkable as an individual unit.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I would say it's important to have not only a motorcycle that you're comfortable on trying to learn, but I think it's really helpful to ride as many different motorcycles as you possibly can. Just because now you're learning about motorcycles as a category instead of a single bike.
Right. And I think that's the point I was sort of stumbling towards a minute ago, that you can't know from a spec sheet that a bike is good-natured enough for you to learn on. That things like horsepower and top speed are kind of abstractions when you actually, throw a leg over. Bikes send these non-functional signals that either calm us down or amp us up. The note of the exhaust, or how responsive the controls are. The sense of being in the machine versus on the machine. Even to some extent how they look. I have found that lots of things that don't turn up on spec sheets can turn out to be anxiety producers or anxiety, reducers, and I think that completely supports this idea of, ride as many as you can. I don't know.
Yeah, spec sheets are really spec sheets are irrelevant. I mean, they're distracting, they're misleading. There's some things about them that might be meaningful, but the only thing that really matters is what the bike feels like when you're riding it.
Yeah, that's hard to argue with. I don't know. I don't know if you ever punish yourself by visiting internet forums, but I do sometimes lurk there. And every once in a while, you'll see a raging debate about something like helmets or ATGAT or high vis. And at some point in the argument, because usually it's an argument by this time, somebody will bring up this idea of risk homeostasis. So this seems to me to be the notion that the safer we feel, the more chances we take. And yet, based partly on the conversation we just had, it seems to me that one good strategy for addressing fear on a bike is to insulate yourself from the foreseeable risks in some way, which seems to be seems to collide with this theory of, risk homeostasis. So I'm kind of wondering, besides the practical benefit, it seems like a bit of confidence helps if you, if you manage the manageable risks. What do you think about that? Or are we back on this bubble again?
Okay. Well, I guess I would say I have a little problem with the risk homeostasis. Not that I don't think it has some meaning. Definitely, if I'm trying to find the sweet spot of my anxiety and I'm becoming more and more competent, and therefore it takes more and more and more to make me anxious, and then I just keep pushing further and further and further. I guess that has to be coupled with something like, I would also remember that I'm on a public street.
Right.
Or, it seems like it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So given, if you include that bit in it, that risk homeostasis might also be governed by some common sense or realistic appraisal of what's appropriate when, then I don't know. I lose the paradox.
Right.
If I include that.
Right. So it's actually a dumb argument, which is kind of how I feel too. But it is forcefully asserted when these questions are discussed by the beasts that inhabit the internet.
I do want to. I do want to put in a plug for internet forums, just in the sense that while it is, and I know that you realize this, but I do want to encourage people to check out the amazing resources that are available online for things like making a particular repair. There are people who have put unbelievable amount of time and effort and love into laying out things that the rest of us then benefit from when we've screwed something up in the garage at 11 at night and we've got a ride we've got to get to the next morning, and we can get online and see somebody's painstaking efforts to address that very same problem laid out in well done photography and explicit text. And I have been saved by internet forums so many times I really couldn't count them.
Right.
And so anyway, for any of your listeners who haven't made use of that gold mine, I just wanted to point it out that it exists.
Yep, fair enough, and you're right. There's just a bottomless well of generosity out there among motorcyclists online. But you get them into a Talmudic debate about how to clip an apex, and things can get weird. I mentioned skip all the arguments about why this oil is the only one to use. Yeah, oil, perfect. That's exactly right. Earlier in this conversation, I mentioned Todd Egan, who I interviewed in the second episode of this podcast. And when I spoke with him, he kind of summarized his advice about cornering technique, and by extension, I guess, just competence in general, with three things. He said, ride lots, which I think you've you've echoed here. He said, have fun. And he said, always bet you're going to make it. If the worst comes to the worst, then the low side's better than the high side was, kind of the nut of it. Assuming that you think that's good advice, ride lots, have fun, always bet you're going to make it. How useful do you think that is to riders who are dealing with fear?
Well, I like that advice, at least in theory. I can imagine that sometimes people will have trouble believing that they're going to make it. It seems like that's kind of what we've been discussing about those moments when you don't think you're going to make it.
Yeah.
Actually, I had a mountain biking buddy of mine tell me that that's how he knew he'd had a good ride. He knew it was a good ride if at some point during the ride he really doubted whether or not he was going to make it back. And I have to say there's in reviewing my own experience with riding, and maybe this goes back to that thing that you were talking about where the level of challenge is directly related to the sense of achievement. That is true. The most memorable rides I've had are the ones where there was really serious doubt in my mind about whether or not I was going to make it back. But again, I didn't plan for that to happen. It wasn't like I went looking for that.
Right.
It's just sometimes that's what happens on a ride. Anyway, I would just take issue with how much volition can be exercised in that third piece of advice.
Right. I think it might have applied specifically to cornering, but I take your point. I'm pretty sure that there are people listening to this who have nodded a lot during this conversation, because as I told you, I've heard from some of them. And, there are people who love motorcycles and love riding, but are kind of dogged by this nagging fear. Not quite so much that they know they need to give it up, but enough that it's constantly detracting from the experience in some way, if I can put it like that. Or at least they wonder if this fear is trying to tell them something that they should listen to. What would you say to that person?
Well, I instantly think of two different subcategories in the group that you're describing. There are people who may have had some traumatic experience with riding, or even outside the world of riding, but that traumatic experience is impacting their riding. I should call out a resource or list a resource here that might be helpful for such folks. There's a psychologist named, or I guess I'm not sure if she's technically a psychologist. She's a hypnotherapist in San Diego. Her name is Brenda Bates, and she wrote a book. I guess it's probably, 15, 18 years old now. But she wrote a book called Getting Back in the Saddle. And it's specifically for people who have had some kind of, they may have had a really bad wreck, and, they're having trouble getting back on the bike or being able to ride with enjoyment because they're haunted by fears that, of repeating the terrible experience that they had. She goes into a lot of detail in her book. In fact, she really made it a specialty of her practice to help motorcyclists get back on their motorcycles after traumatic experiences. So I would recommend her book. I think I said Getting Back in the Saddle Again. I think it's just Back in the Saddle Again. And I bet you can find it on Amazon.
Right.
Anyway.
That's interesting.
Yeah. The other group, people who are just kind of chronically fearful, not necessarily because of some specific traumatic experience they had riding, I would say that the two things. One is there are ways to reduce the physiological arousal that is a component of fearfulness. You can look up relaxation training on YouTube and get guided protocols for learning how to do this. There are breathing techniques. There are lots of things that people can do that are really it's not specific to riding. It's just about reducing your level of physiological arousal. And so I suspect that some such folk are just kind of chronically over-aroused in their central nervous system, and they need ways to manage that. And they need to be bodily interventions. There are all sorts of little devices that work on principles of biofeedback, for example, that can help people reduce the level of physiological arousal. So there's that. And then I would say the other thing that would be crucial is to have a riding buddy. I think that the social element here, the interpersonal element, can be extremely powerful. So if you have somebody who is really a companion and an ally, and perhaps they know more than you and they can teach you things, but I don't think that's really what's crucial here. I think it's about having another person in it with you. We are pack animals, and we derive comfort from, having colleagues and having other people that know what we're going through and are going through something similar. And so I would encourage such people to really home in on somebody who they can ride with on a regular basis and talk about the riding experience with frequently. And I would expect that to have a considerable impact.
Right. Right. So long as those people were not, it seems to me it could be a bit toxic hanging around somebody who had all kinds of talent and all kinds of bravery to go with it. I think there's an implication in what you're saying that we're also looking for empathy in that riding partner. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That's great. That is great advice. That is great advice. So I just have one more question, and it involves a bit of a preamble, and it's sort of personal, but I'm hoping that something of value comes out of it. So I'm going to sort of break my rule that these aren't about me, and see whether there's something universal here. So you talked a minute ago, something you said reminded me of how I think you talked about the sort of constantly excited nervous system. So I gave up horseback riding some years ago because I just was exhausted with being afraid all the time. The cost and the commitment of that sport is enormous, and the risk is significant. You're 15 more times likely to get hurt on a horse than you are on a motorcycle. Just not as likely to die doing it. And it just got to be not worth it. And I sort of gave up and walked away not feeling especially good about myself. And it was at about that time that I took up riding again, which I had not done since I was a kid. So what's important here is that I am that fearful person. I'm super cautious. I'm the worrier in the family. I'm risk averse in every way. And so I'm kind of Bill in some ways, including probably the way that I learn. So the punchline here is that motorcycling stands out for me as the one dangerous thing I've done in my life that doesn't scare me. I mean, obviously, I get a bolt of fear if I screw up or if I have a close call or if I exceed my comfort zone in some significant way. But the act of riding does not scare me at all. which, maybe that's a problem. But I guess I have two questions. One is, any guesses as to why that is? And secondly, do you think that that defeating fear is one of the kind of pillars of what makes people fall in love with doing this?
Oh, those are excellent questions. I don't know how to answer the first one other than to say just because motorcycling is the best and you shouldn't have wasted your time with horses.
Okay, done. I'll accept that.
As for the second one, I think that human beings, at least when they have not been cowed by horrible experiences in their lives, I think humans naturally crave challenge and the opportunity to increase their mastery. And it's sort of like an innate drive for growth. And motorcycling supplies so many different dimensions in which we can do that. There's the stuff that we've been describing today about, riding technique. But, what about navigating? What about developing mechanical proficiency? What about finding your way into a social group, that the local riding club or a group of people on an overlook on your favorite mountain ride? There are just an extraordinarily wide range of ways in which people can push themselves and grow and become more competent. And so, yes, I absolutely think that's a big part of what draws us to motorcycling. Mastering fear is one such dimension. And, I think that it is part of what makes it exciting. Fear in small doses we call excitement, right? So it's, in some sense, it's all about fear. If you really want to break it down to something molecular. If there wasn't fear involved, we wouldn't enjoy it.
Right.
But that's not to say that we're out to, we're exercising a death wish or we're just trying to scare ourselves. But finding that edge and pushing close to it is, I think, just inherently pleasurable and rewarding.
Yep. And I think that you probably nailed it when you said there's so many ways we can grow doing this. I think that's probably what makes it so sticky. It isn't just a matter of taking chances and surviving, but rather that the opportunities to learn things and grow are, emerge with every ride, and that's a drug that it's pretty hard to beat.
Yeah.
Mark, this has just been fascinating. I'm looking at my stopwatch here, and I'm thinking I've probably kept you already a little longer than promised, but I can't thank you enough for speaking with me. There's tons to think about here, and I think the people who inspired this episode are going to appreciate it a lot.
Well, I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope that something we talked does have personal meaning to a listener, and I'm really happy that you gave me a call and gave me this opportunity. I enjoyed the chat and would have whether or not it was being published in a podcast.
Yeah, which is another part of what makes motorcycling so great. I'm glad you found it enjoyable, but it in no way diminishes my gratitude. We'll let you know when it's up, and in the meantime, ride safe out there. And I hope we get a chance to shake hands in person one of these days.
Yes, certainly. If you venture down to the Smoky Mountains and want to sample Deals Gap or Windrock off-road, I know you're not doing dirt these days, but maybe we can find you a ride, and I'll try to convert you.
That's a little scary, ironically, but okay, I'll accept that challenge. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Wherever there's fear, shame usually isn't very far behind. And that's probably why, despite being able to find literally millions of pieces of content online dealing with fear in motorcycles, I couldn't find a single piece of data to show how many riders actually experience it. And I wonder if that's because the answer is 100%. I told Mark that the act of riding a motorcycle doesn't scare me, but that's not really the whole truth. There are certain situations that do, and I avoid those, maybe more than I should. Thinking about this after our conversation, I realized that a total absence of fear would be a signal that I'd stop growing. I'm fascinated by this idea of what he called the optimal level of anxiety. And I wonder if the people who worry about having fear on a bike might simply be on a journey to becoming the best kind of rider. And I wonder if maybe the most dangerous thing a motorcyclist might ever encounter is their own arrogance. But it turns out that fear does more for us than tell us whether we're pushing ourselves hard enough, or, for that matter, too hard. Fear, it seems to me, in small doses, is the currency we use to buy experience. With every ride, we trade it for expanding our motorcycle lives, for great stories to tell, and for the feeling that we might have more potential in us than we imagined. The rewards of staying on that bubble, of having just enough fear, can remain our companions for as long as we ride if we let them. Mark Barnes said that riding motorcycles is all about fear, and I think what that means is that it's all about balance. There are probably some people whose anxiety on a motorcycle is so overwhelming that riding is a bad idea at this moment in their lives. But for the rest of us, our ambivalent relationship with fear seems like the vital ingredient in the recipe that makes these machines so magical. And if you still aren't sure about that, then let's give the last word on this ambivalence to Hunter S. Thompson, a name you wouldn't normally associate with a nuanced view of motorcycles. "I understand that fear is my friend, but not always," he once wrote. "Never turn your back on fear. It should always be in front of you, like a thing that might have to be killed." Well, dark, but wise. Thanks for listening. You'll find show notes for this episode at thismotorcyclelife.com, including information on Mark's book, Why We Ride, and some of the resources he mentioned in this conversation. That's also how you can reach me if you have questions, comments, or suggestions. Emailing me at thismotorcyclelife@gmail.com works too, and every email gets an answer. You can also follow me on Instagram, where I like to post pictures of bikes I find on the street, and where you can follow a lot of the people I've interviewed for this podcast. This episode's playlist recommendation is so obscure you can't even buy it. Searching for music to go with the theme of the show, I fell down a bit of a SoundCloud rabbit hole and found this brilliant cover of a song that would be just a little too on the nose if it wasn't so chilled out and awesome. The artist is an independent performer and producer from Wiltshire in the UK by the name of Gary Saunders. The track needs no introduction. I hope you like it, and keep staying alive out there.
All our times have come here, but now they're gone. Seasons don't feel a reaper.